In the darkest and most forgotten pages of the Civil War, in those blood-soaked chapters of American history that official military historians have consciously and systematically ignored, there exists an extraordinary story that veterans of the Western Theater whispered to each other in the muddy, rat-infested trenches of Vicksburg and Gettysburg. A story they told only in the deepest hours of the night. When the artillery fire fell silent for a moment and the shadows of the fallen seemed to wander across the no-man's land between Union and Confederate lines. It is the legend of Brigadier General James William Harrison of Boston, the legendary Union cavalry officer from an old Massachusetts family, who never thought of surrendering and who was ready to fight for the Union and the Constitution until his last breath, and his enigmatic, mysterious horse named Stormwind. This majestic black Morgan stallion was definitely no ordinary animal, no normal cavalry mount like the thousands that served in the horse regiments of the Union Army. Born in 1861 on the famous Woodstock Farm in the deep Vermont wilderness, in the geographical and spiritual heart of New England, in those endless green pastures where for generations the finest horses in America had been bred. And from his very first, powerful whinny as a newborn foal, all men who knew him and worked with him swore that he possessed inexplicable, almost supernatural abilities. His coal-black coat, without a single white mark, gleamed like polished obsidian or like the surface of a still, deep lake under moonlight, and his large, expressive eyes reflected an almost human intelligence that disturbed and fascinated anyone who looked into them. On his powerful neck and muscular flanks, he bore the honorable battle scars of 3 years of bitter warfare. Deep shrapnel wounds from Confederate artillery shells, narrow bullet grazes from Springfield rifles, jagged bayonet traces from rebel charges at Antietam, scars that together formed a living, breathing map of 32 major armed engagements, battles where death had come so close that it had almost touched the stallion with its bony, icy fingers. Stormwind had carried the general through impossible battles, through strategic retreats across apocalyptic battlefields where death not only seemed inevitable but was practically guaranteed, through breakneck nighttime gallops over paths that disappeared in the thick, impenetrable fog of the Tennessee valleys like ghost trails in a nightmare. The battle-hardened soldiers of Harrison's famous 2nd Massachusetts Volunteer Cavalry Regiment told stories about this extraordinary animal that sounded like the fantastic tales of drunken men, stories so incredible they couldn't possibly be true. But all swore by the honor of their families and by their military oath that every word was pure, undiluted truth. Stories of how this remarkable horse seemed to possess a completely supernatural compass, a mystical inner map that showed him exactly where he needed to go, even when the night was so pitch black that you literally couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, when the fog was so thick it stood around them like a gray wall, when the men had to follow completely blind and disoriented the rhythmic, reassuring sound of the animal's hooves and trust his seemingly impossible sense of direction, as if Stormwind had a direct telepathic connection to the spirits of the land itself. The Confederate cavalry and the elite units of Stuart's horse artillery, those few experienced and hardened soldiers who had actually survived direct military encounters with the notorious General Harrison and his devilish regiment, later told their own comrades with trembling voices and incredulous eyes how the ambushes and traps they had planned for weeks with military precision and scientific care, which they had designed with the expertise of graduates of the famous Virginia Military Institute and other renowned Southern academies, completely collapsed and proved utterly useless in a matter of minutes, for the simple but incomprehensible reason that this cursed, diabolical horse, this animal with the eyes of Satan himself, led his Union rider with seemingly clairvoyant precision to exactly those spots where Confederate bullets definitely didn't expect him, where their carefully calculated fields of fire went into empty air. That horse smells the devil himself, the frightened and demoralized Confederate soldiers said with superstitious fear in their voices when they saw the dreaded Union general riding his black demon horse during an ambush they had meticulously organized according to all rules of military science, with experienced sharpshooters placed in strategically optimal positions, with cannons positioned so they should have caught the Union officer without any possible escape route, should have torn him to pieces. But every time, with every single attack, the cursed animal seemed to know where danger lurked and led his rider as if by miracle through the deadly zones, as if invisible angels or demons were showing him the way. The truly disturbing and inexplicable thing about Stormwind, however, was not his obvious physical superiority, not his impressive speed that allowed him to outrun Confederate cavalry as if they were standing still, not his extraordinary endurance that enabled him to gallop for days without showing signs of fatigue, not even the almost superhuman ability he possessed to gallop for 5 or 6 days in a row without extended rest while other horses collapsed exhausted after a day. The truly mysterious and frightening thing was his seemingly prophetic ability to recognize and anticipate deadly dangers long before they had even materialized, before they existed as tangible, physical threats in the real world. as if he could see into the future or as if he were in constant telepathic communication with the spirits of those about to die. On exactly 32 carefully documented occasions, recorded in the official regimental protocols and in the personal diaries of several officers, Stormwind had saved General Harrison's life through seemingly completely irrational, inexplicable behavior that seemed completely incomprehensible and even disturbing at the moment, dramatic acts of direct disobedience toward his rider that initially made the proud Massachusetts general angry and frustrated, but which later, sometimes hours, sometimes days later, invariably proved to be precise, detailed premonitions of catastrophes and tragedies that never occurred because they had been prevented by the mysterious intervention of the animal. The experienced men who had ridden and fought beside the general for years, who had survived the battles of Bull Run and Shiloh, learned very quickly and with great respect to read and interpret the complex body language of this extraordinary animal like a secret, encrypted code of approaching death. The specific, nervous trembling of his thick black mane when deadly danger came from the north and Confederate artillery hid in the woods. The particular, characteristic movement of his pointed, alert ears when an immediate threat approached from the east and rebel infantry crawled through the trenches, the sharp, piercing and almost human-sounding whinny he emitted when he sensed an impending ambush. That sound that froze the blood in the veins of every man who had once heard it and that echoed in the nightmares of survivors. Colonel Samuel Adams Brown, a man from an old Boston military family who had ridden beside Harrison for 8 years of practically uninterrupted warfare, from the first days of Lincoln's call for volunteers in April 1861 to the desperate final campaigns of 1865, wrote in his detailed memoirs, which were published only decades later and are today considered one of the most important documents about Union cavalry in the Civil War, that Stormwind had once near the destroyed Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg categorically refused to cross a seemingly completely harmless wooden bridge, a bridge that appeared perfectly safe and solid to any human observer and that had been used by Union troops dozens of times without incident. The general, furious at this apparent, and seemingly completely groundless stubbornness of his normally obedient horse, had brutally beaten the proud animal with his heavy leather riding whip, again and again and again, until warm blood dripped from his flanks and his black hide was crossed with red welts, but Stormwind remained with a determination that seemed almost human, completely steadfast in his absolute refusal to set even a single hoof on that bridge. Brigadier General James Harrison finally decided, after trying for almost half an hour in vain to force his stallion to obedience, to dismount and personally cross the damned bridge on foot to prove once and for all its firmness and safety and demonstrate the irrationality of his horse. Exactly halfway across the construction, 3 rotten planks suddenly and without warning gave way under his weight, and the surprised general plunged headfirst into the cold, muddy water, which fortunately was not particularly deep at this point. Had he been riding Stormwind at that moment, the fall would have been absolutely catastrophic, most certainly fatal for both man and horse. As Harrison emerged dripping wet and boiling with rage from the icy water, his tailored Massachusetts uniform ruined and mud-stained, he looked at Stormwind with completely new eyes, with an expression that mixed wonder, respect, and even a kind of religious awe. The majestic black stallion stood completely calm and composed where he had left him, staring at his drenched master with those deep, intelligent eyes, as if he knew exactly what had just happened and why it had happened, as if he had consciously and deliberately saved his beloved rider's life. From that memorable day, the proud Massachusetts general never again doubted, not for a single second, the mysterious and inexplicable instincts of his extraordinary horse, and all men of the regiment learned very quickly to respect the remarkable animal with a reverence normally reserved only for supernatural or divine beings. It was the 10th of April, 1863. The Civil War raged at its bloodiest and most desperate moment, its flames consuming entire cities and towns, consuming families, transforming farmers into soldiers and peaceful citizens into ghosts of war. The Union found itself at a crucial juncture. The war had dragged on far longer than anyone had expected, becoming an endless struggle in trenches and fortifications where men lived and died like animals. The Confederacy, though weakened, still fought with desperate determination, and morale among some Union troops had begun to waver under the enormous casualties. Harrison needed to coordinate decisive tactical movements with his allies in the Western Theater, that strip of land where the war had carved such deep wounds into the American soil that they would never heal. A strategic meeting in the Tennessee town of Franklin could change the course of the war, or at least so the general believed. At this meeting, plans would be discussed for a coordinated breakthrough attempt in 3 sectors simultaneously, a desperate movement that could force the Confederate High Command to negotiate or even bring about a turning point in the war. Brigadier General James Harrison mounted Stormwind in the early morning hours, when the sun had not yet gained enough strength to burn off the thick fog that hung over the hills of Middle Tennessee. He wore his field uniform, dirty and stained with dust from countless battles, covered with dried mud stains and blood spatters that gave him the appearance of having wandered through hell itself. His cavalry hat was dented on one side by a Confederate bullet that had missed him by inches 3 weeks earlier during a fierce engagement near Stones River. His face, tanned and weathered by the merciless sun of Tennessee and the icy winds of Virginia winters, showed deep furrows carved by the determination of one who had nothing left to lose except his ideals. Except the vision of a Union where American freedom and democratic virtues were not sacrificed to the cannons of the Confederacy. His eyes, once blue and clear as a summer day in Massachusetts, were now clouded with a steel-gray seriousness, the gaze of a man who had seen too much blood, buried too many friends, and followed too many impossible orders. His escort consisted of 43 men of various backgrounds, each of them a veteran of the bloody years since 1861, loyal officers from old New England families who had accompanied him since the first campaign in Virginia, armed escorts with Springfield rifles that seemed like natural extensions of their arms, war veterans with scars that told stories of impossible battles, men who had fought at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, and some young recruits who wanted to join the cause. Boys of 16 or 17 years from farms in Ohio and Indiana who still believed the war was glorious and that they could die for Union and Constitution. These young men did not yet have the hollow eyes of veterans, not yet the nervous twitches of those who had survived too many artillery barrages, not yet the quiet desperation of those who knew this war was taking far longer than anyone had imagined. As they galloped through the devastated Tennessee countryside toward Franklin on that foggy April morning, the general observed the total destruction around him with the trained eyes of a soldier who had survived 3 years of war. Every broken tree, every shell crater, every abandoned ruin told the story of this endless conflict. He thought about the desperate strategy the Union High Command had developed, about the impossible military movements that had to be executed, about the small hope that still remained to defeat the Confederate forces who grew more desperate and dangerous with each passing day. The Union's situation in April 1863 was challenging but not without hope. In the Western Theater, Union forces were slowly gaining ground, bleeding the Confederate lines daily, but at enormous cost in men and material. The replacement troops coming from the northern states were increasingly younger, but better equipped and supplied than their Confederate counterparts. In the great northern cities, factories worked around the clock producing weapons and supplies for the war effort. The Union's industrial superiority was beginning to tell, but the human cost was staggering. The Emancipation Proclamation had transformed the war from a conflict about Union to a moral crusade about slavery, energizing abolitionists but also hardening Confederate resistance. International opinion was gradually shifting toward the Union, but European powers remained officially neutral. The Union blockade was slowly strangling the Confederate economy, but Southern determination seemed unbreakable. At the Eastern Theater, despite recent setbacks, the Army of the Potomac remained a formidable force, while in the West, Grant's methodical campaigns were slowly but surely crushing Confederate resistance. The war had become a contest of endurance, of industrial capacity, of national will, and increasingly, it seemed the Union had the advantage in all three. But the cost was terrible. American boys from Maine to California were dying in unprecedented numbers. Families torn apart by a conflict that seemed to consume everything it touched. President Lincoln aged visibly under the burden, and the political pressure for either victory or negotiated peace grew daily. This meeting in Franklin represented one of many desperate attempts to find a strategic breakthrough that could end the bloodshed. Stormwind galloped at the head of the escort. As always, his rhythmic gallop so natural and synchronized with his rider's movements that the two seemed like a single mythological entity, like a centaur of flesh, steel, and unyielding American courage. The general rode with the upright posture of a Massachusetts cavalry officer, but his thoughts were dark and filled with doubts. He knew this meeting in Franklin might be their last chance to achieve a decisive victory before the war dragged on even longer, claiming even more American lives. The soldiers of his escort behaved as soldiers always behave when moving deep in contested territory. Some joked with the false, exaggerated cheerfulness of men trying to drown out their fear of death. Others sang softly traditional Union songs and melancholic folk tunes they had composed during long, lonely nights in camp, songs that told of past battles, of fallen comrades, of the distant homes that seemed so unreachable, of sweethearts and wives who might be waiting in vain for their return. Others nervously and compulsively checked their weapons, verifying for the 10th or 20th time that the mechanisms of their Springfield rifles functioned perfectly, that the cartridges sat correctly in the chambers, that their sabers were sharp and ready for battle, that their pistols were loaded and within easy reach. These were ritual, almost religious actions of men who knew from painful, bloody experience that their lives hung by a silken thread that depended entirely on the absolute reliability of their equipment. A young recruit from a farm in Indiana, barely 17 years old, with rosy cheeks and the clear eyes of innocence, sang softly a song his mother had taught him, an old folk song about a soldier who fought in a distant land. His voice trembled slightly, not from cold, but from a mixture of excitement and fear. He had come to the front only 2 weeks ago and had never killed a man, had never heard the sound of a bullet whistling close past his head, had never smelled the sickly sweet smell of human blood or tasted the metallic flavor of fear on his tongue. Beside him rode a veteran of the Battle of Antietam, a man in his early 30s whose face was marked by shrapnel scars and whose left hand had only 3 fingers. He watched the singing boy with a mixture of pity and nostalgia, remembering his own innocence that had died 3 years ago in the meat grinder of Sharpsburg. He knew this boy probably wouldn't survive, that most of them wouldn't survive, but he said nothing. What could he have said? It was a typical wartime march through contested territory, full of that deceptive security that constant movement provides, that deep and dangerous illusion that death cannot reach you as long as you keep moving, that speed protects you, that fate cannot strike you if you never stand still, never pause, never stop moving forward. The landscape through which they rode told the story of the war in every burned ruin, in every destroyed farmhouse, in every torn-up field, where once green Tennessee pastures and grain fields had been, now stretched moonscapes of shell craters, broken trees, and rusting barbed wire entanglements. Abandoned villages stared at them with empty windows, their inhabitants long fled or buried. The sickly sweet smell of death and decay still hung in the air, mixed with the smell of gunpowder and the metallic taste of blood that never quite left one's nose. Here and there, the remains of Union or Confederate positions jutted from the earthworks and dugouts that now served as mute monuments to the futility of this endless slaughter. Then, as the Tennessee town of Franklin appeared on the horizon, its church spires barely visible through the morning mist, and the Harpeth River appeared before them, its dark brown water reflecting the gray April sky, the famous Franklin Bridge emerged on the horizon like a monument to human engineering, a massive structure of heavy oak timber, reinforced with wrought iron beams and steel girders, built just 15 years earlier by the hands of Tennessee workers who probably never imagined their work would become the scene of a military tragedy. The bridge spanned the river in an elegant arch that seemed challenging and proud of its own solidity, of its proven ability to bear the weight of men, horses, artillery pieces, and heavy wagons. It was the only safe and practical crossing within 20 miles. All other routes led either to treacherous swamps and marshes where even light horses could sink belly deep in viscous, black mud, or to dangerous fords where the water was too deep and the current too strong, or to steep gorges and rock faces where a single false step meant certain death. This bridge was the geographical bottleneck that controlled access to Franklin from the north, the vital artery through which all military movements in this region had to flow. Whoever controlled this bridge effectively controlled the movement of entire armies in this part of Tennessee. No one in the Union escort knew, or at least they believed they didn't, that beneath this seemingly harmless bridge, carefully and methodically hidden among the massive wooden beams and stone foundations that sank deep into the riverbed, Confederate sappers had systematically placed explosives over several weeks. These weren't just a few primitive powder kegs, but a carefully calculated amount of the most modern explosive materials. Dozens of pounds of black powder and nitroglycerin, professionally packed in waterproof casings and wrapped with oiled canvas to protect them from the constant moisture of the river, all connected by a complex network of fuses that ran through specially made iron pipes, everything carefully calculated and planned by Confederate military engineers who had studied at West Point and other renowned American academies. It was a perfect trap, a poison bait that waited only for the exact moment to activate, to transform itself from harmless architecture into deafening, all-destroying death. Confederate spies, those shadow men who operated in the dark corners of taverns and farmhouses, who posed as Tennessee civilians or even as Union deserters, had been meticulously reporting for weeks that General Harrison would cross over this very bridge on his way to the secret meeting in Franklin. Their reports had been precise and detailed. The number of men in his escort, the route he would take, even the approximate time of his arrival. The order came directly from Confederate headquarters in Richmond, signed by General Lee personally, to wait until the Union general and his entire escort were exactly in the middle of the bridge, at that point where they could escape neither forward nor backward, where they were completely trapped in a wooden structure that would transform in seconds into their grave. Then they should detonate the explosives, cause a spectacular explosion that would completely pulverize the bridge, that would kill the Union general, his officers, all soldiers accompanying him in a single, annihilating blow. It would be a spectacular success of Confederate warfare, the death of the Blue Rider, as Harrison was called by his enemies, the end of one of the most dangerous Union military operations in the Western theater. But no one in the entire Confederate command chain, from the spies to the generals in Richmond, had reckoned with Stormwind. As Harrison approached the bridge with his escort and led them to what everyone thought was a routine meeting that could possibly influence the course of the war, Stormwind began for the first time in years to show signs of extreme unrest. These weren't subtle signs that only an extraordinarily experienced horseman could have recognized. These were dramatic behaviors that spoke of pure, primitive animal panic. Of such immediate and terrible threat perception that the stallion seemed to see with the eyes of death itself, as if he could look into a dimension that was invisible to humans. First, it was just nervous, unrhythmic pawing with his hooves, behavior that Harrison had never observed in his otherwise so disciplined horse. Stormwind slowed his normally precise and even gallop without the general pulling on the reins or giving any other command. His ears, normally attentively pointed forward and focused on his rider's commands, now moved restlessly and nervously back and forth, as if he heard sounds that no human ear could perceive, as if he were listening to frequencies that lay beyond normal perception. Then he began to snort, short, sharp, panicked breaths that looked like small steam clouds in the cold morning air and conveyed an image of growing fear. "What's wrong with you, old boy?" murmured Harrison with the voice of a man who had known his animal companion for years and had never experienced such behavior. He patted reassuringly and lovingly Stormwind's muscular neck, feeling the tension in the muscles under the gleaming black coat. The horse responded with a restless, almost human-sounding whinny and violent head shaking that made his thick black mane flutter wildly, as if he were trying to shake an invisible net from his head. As they approached the bridge to about 50 yards, Stormwind's agitation intensified dramatically and in a way that was disturbing even to the most experienced cavalryman. His normally long, elegant, and even steps became noticeably shorter, more hesitant, uncertain, as if each step toward the bridge caused him physical pain. He began a nervous, uncharacteristic sideways dancing, a complex sidestep maneuver that showed all signs of extreme psychological stress and forced General Harrison to use all his horsemanship and years of experience just to stay in the saddle. Stormwind's large, normally calm eyes became unnaturally wide, showing the whites in a way that any experienced rider would have immediately recognized as a sign of extreme panic, as a sign of fear so deep and primitive that it almost drove the animal insane. His nostrils flared dramatically, almost comically wide, as if he scented a smell that meant pure, absolute terror to him, as if the air itself were poisoned with the scent of coming death, as if he could smell something completely imperceptible to human senses. His entire muscular body began to tremble, not from cold or exertion, but from fear so deep and instinctive that it completely took over his innate survival instincts. His tail whipped nervously back and forth, another warning for anyone who could read the language of horses. But the most disturbing of all was the sound he began to make, a deep, guttural groan that sounded almost human, a sound of protest and despair that Harrison had never heard from his horse in all those years. "Stormwind," called Harrison with the sharp, impatient authority of a Union officer who since childhood had been accustomed to having his orders followed immediately and without contradiction, to having men and animals alike obey his will. "What the devil has gotten into you? Behave like an American cavalry horse. That's an order." But for the first time in their years-long partnership, for the first time since Harrison had received the stallion as a young horse, Stormwind did not obey. What had practically never happened in their relationship, what violated all military order and all training, occurred: complete disobedience. Instead, the horse stopped abruptly, so suddenly that Harrison was almost thrown from the saddle, completely motionless, all four hooves firmly and immovably planted in the muddy clay soil of the riverbank, as if they were set in concrete or bound by invisible chains. His entire body posture, every muscle, every line of his body spoke of absolute, unshakable resistance, of a determination that went deeper than any human training, was stronger than any discipline, more primitive and powerful than any obedience. It was as if an invisible but absolutely impenetrable wall existed between him and the bridge, a barrier of pure fear and supernatural intuition that only he could see and feel, a mystical obstacle that was completely invisible to humans. The 43-man escort began to gather around their beloved general, disturbed and confused, their horses nervously whinnying and prancing as they sensed the extreme tension of their lead horse. Confused and concerned voices rose above the peaceful sound of flowing water and the distant but constant rumble of artillery at the front, which never completely fell silent, even here, so far from the main battlefields. "General, sir," said Colonel Samuel Brown with the cautious voice of a man who had known and respected his commander for years, as he rode his own increasingly restless horse closer and examined Stormwind's completely atypical condition with the trained, experienced eyes of a lifelong cavalry officer who had seen hundreds of horses in all possible situations. "What's wrong with Stormwind? Is he perhaps injured? Has he hurt himself somehow? I've never seen him like this." Harrison half dismounted and began with the experienced, gentle hands of a man who had spent his entire life with horses, who had learned as a boy on his father's estate in Massachusetts to understand horses, quickly and thoroughly to examine the legs and hooves of his valuable animal. He felt with the expertise of a veterinarian every muscle, every tendon, every bone, searching for signs of injury, lameness, swelling, heat, anything that could explain the completely bizarre and inexplicable behavior. There was absolutely nothing to be found. No visible wounds, no cuts, no bruises, no swelling, no abnormal heat that would indicate inflammation or infection. Stormwind was physically in perfect condition, a paragon of equine health and strength. His muscles were firm and strong. His coat gleamed with health. His breathing was regular. But his psychological state became more extreme and disturbing with each passing second, as if an invisible force were filling his mind with panic. "He is physically completely unharmed," Harrison replied through gritted teeth with an undertone of growing frustration and the voice of a man accustomed to having the world function according to his will, to having obstacles removed, to having problems have solutions. "He's just damn stubborn and irrational. I don't understand what the devil has gotten into him. Maybe he's gone mad. Come on, Stormwind. Old boy. We must cross this bridge. The fate of the Union could depend on this meeting. That's a direct order." The general drove his heavy riding spurs more decisively and harder into Stormwind's flanks, a signal that in their years-long partnership normally would have resulted in immediate and unquestioning obedience. The silver spurs, a family heirloom that his grandfather had worn at Bull Run, pressed painfully into the horse's flesh. But the animal did not move a single millimeter forward toward the cursed bridge. Instead, he took a decisive, almost human-seeming step backward, then another, and another, as if he were actively and consciously fleeing from the bridge. It was as if the stallion were being pulled away from the bridge by an invisible hand, by a force stronger than any physical compulsion a human could exert, stronger than years of military training and iron American discipline. His eyes, which normally radiated trust and obedience, now showed something that looked almost like human desperation, as if he wanted to communicate something to his master that lay beyond the possibilities of animal communication. General Harrison's famous Massachusetts patience, already severely strained and nearly exhausted by 3 years of the bloodiest war in American history, began to dwindle dangerously and visibly. His face reddened with anger and embarrassment. He was a man from a family that had been accustomed for generations to receiving absolute obedience, to the immediate and unquestioning response to orders from both human subordinates and animals. Stormwind's completely atypical behavior was not only confusing and inexplicable, it was unacceptable and deeply humiliating. To be challenged and publicly defeated by his own horse in front of his 43 best men, in front of officers and veterans who had respected and admired him for years, was a humiliation that he as a proud Union officer and American gentleman could not and would not tolerate. It questioned his authority, his competence, his right to command. "Damned, stubborn beast." He finally growled with a voice trembling with suppressed rage and wounded pride, and drew his heavy leather riding whip from the special holder on his saddle. The whip was a family heirloom, handcrafted by the best saddlers in Boston, with a handle of polished ebony and a long, braided leather thong that had served his father and grandfather. "You will cross this cursed bridge whether you want to or not. I am your master and commander. And you will obey me as befits an American horse." He began to whip Stormwind systematically and mercilessly, heavy, angry blows that landed with scientific precision on the stallion's flanks and muscular back, immediately leaving red welts and marks on the gleaming black coat. With each brutal lash, the noble animal jumped to the side, whinnying in obvious, heartbreaking pain and protest, an almost human cry of agony, but still moved not a single step toward the cursed, seemingly harmless bridge. The whipping seemed only to strengthen his iron refusal, to deepen his panic, to reinforce his mysterious determination, as if each blow confirmed his supernatural instincts. The harder Harrison struck, the more blood dripped from the animal's flanks, the more desperate and wild Stormwind's resistance became, the clearer his silent but desperate protest became. The men of the escort observed silently and increasingly disturbed this painful and unusual spectacle. Some muttered quietly among themselves, confused and concerned comments about the completely atypical behavior of the normally so obedient and disciplined horse that was almost revered like a mascot in their community. Others began to become nervous themselves. Their own horses sensed the extreme tension in the air and the fear of their lead animal and began to become restless, pawing the ground and whinnying nervously, their eyes rolling, and some began to prance. The animals in the escort seemed instinctively to understand what their human companions could not or would not understand. That something fundamentally and dangerously wrong was here, that a threat loomed that lay beyond normal, everyday war dangers, something that alarmed their most primitive survival instincts. "General, sir," Colonel Brown finally dared to say, his normally firm voice now cautious and respectful, but with a distinct undertone of growing concern. Perhaps we should look for another way? There might be a ford further upstream, or we could make a detour? If Stormwind is behaving like this, then he might have a good reason. You've known him for years, and he's never let you down. Silence, hissed Harrison, his patrician face now dark red with exertion and frustration. Sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air, his uniform soaked with sweat and his hands trembling with rage. I will not be prevented by a horse from fulfilling my military duty. I will not be defeated and humiliated by an irrational animal. What would the men think? What would my superiors say? But despite 10 intense, torturous minutes of systematic whipping, despite shouting and cursing in English and Latin, despite all physical and psychological coercive measures that an experienced Union cavalry officer with decades of experience could apply, Stormwind refused with a determination that seemed almost human, with a persistence that bordered on sanctity, absolutely and categorically to set even a single hoof on the Franklin Bridge. His black flanks were now smeared with blood, his eyes full of tears of pain, but his determination was unbroken. He stood there like a living statue of resistance, a monument to animal intuition against human arrogance. Finally, completely beside himself with rage and frustration, his honor and authority publicly questioned, Harrison dismounted and landed with a heavy, angry impact in the muddy clay of the Tennessee riverbank. "Very well, you stubborn beast," he cried with a voice trembling with rage, wounded pride, and American stubbornness. "If you refuse to cross this damned bridge, then I will do it. I will cross it on foot and prove to you and everyone else here that it is completely safe and solid. I will expose your irrationality once and for all." He threw the heavy leather reins with a theatrical, angry gesture to Colonel Brown and marched determinedly and defiantly toward the bridge, his heavy Union military boots clattering loudly and rhythmically on the thick oak planks. A defiant, military rhythm that expressed his contempt for Stormwind's seemingly irrational behavior and underscored his iron determination not to be prevented by any animal, no matter how valuable and beloved, from fulfilling his sacred military duty. Behind him Stormwind remained standing, trembling and breathing heavily, sweat and blood from the whip strikes on his once so magnificent coat, but still absolutely and unshakably refusing to follow his master. His intelligent, expressive eyes remained fixed on the departing general, and in their expression lay something that looked frighteningly human, a mixture of love, desperation, and a kind of resigned sorrow, as if he knew he had done everything in his power. Harrison had taken about 10 determined steps onto the bridge, his boots knocking loudly and confidently on the thick, seemingly solid oak planks, when he noticed something strange and deeply disturbing. The wooden boards under his feet didn't feel as he had expected, not loose or damaged or weathered, as one might expect from a bridge that had been exposed to Tennessee weather and war for 15 years, but somehow unnaturally stiff and firm, almost artificially reinforced, as if they had been recently repaired, reinforced, or manipulated. It was a subtle feeling, an almost imperceptible vibration, but clearly perceptible to a man with Harrison's decades of experience as an officer and engineer. Something wasn't right. The bridge felt wrong. He stopped cautiously and knelt slowly to examine the boards more closely with the trained and suspicious eyes of a military engineer who had learned to notice details that could decide between life and death. Upon closer and more attentive examination, he could clearly see that several boards had obviously and undoubtedly been recently replaced, recognizable by the lighter, fresher color of wood that hadn't had time to weather and age, and by the newer, shinier nails that hadn't yet rusted or taken on the patina of time. The work had been done professionally and carefully, he could recognize as an expert, but the question bored into his mind like an icy dagger. Why would anyone in the middle of a bloody civil war, in the middle of one of the greatest military catastrophes in American history, waste time and precious resources repairing a seemingly intact bridge? Why would the Confederates bother to maintain a bridge mainly used by Union troops? An icy suspicion, cold as the harshest Massachusetts winter, began slowly and inexorably to rise in his militarily trained and suspicious mind, like a dark, threatening storm cloud that threatened to darken the entire horizon. He stood up carefully and slowly and took a few more very cautious steps, testing each step, each board with the meticulous attention of a man whose years of war experience had taught him to mistrust his surroundings and pay attention to the smallest details that could mean the difference between life and death. His military training at West Point had taught him always to expect the unexpected, always to look for what didn't belong. Then, approximately halfway across the bridge, at the point where the construction reached its greatest span over the sluggishly flowing river, where it was farthest from both banks, he heard it, a very faint, almost inaudible, but definitely present rhythmic ticking that seemed to come from the depths of the construction beneath his feet, from the darkness between the wooden beams and steel girders. It was a mechanical, precise sound, regular as a heartbeat, that didn't belong at all to a static wooden construction, that shouldn't be there, that could only mean one thing. Harrison's blood literally froze in his veins. He recognized the sound immediately and with absolute, terrible certainty. He had heard it before, in the underground tunnels and mines of Union lines at Vicksburg, where Confederate sappers and engineers nightly laid mines and installed deadly explosive traps. It was the unmistakable, metallic, hypnotic ticking of a clockwork detonator, a time bomb that was carefully programmed to explode at a specific, pre-calculated moment and destroy everything in its vicinity. The terrible realization struck him like lightning from a clear sky. This bridge, this harmless-looking, elegant construction, was not a simple crossing. It was a carefully prepared, scientifically planned death trap. A perfect military trap. A deadly bait that waited only to snap shut like the jaws of a giant, invisible predator. The Confederates had known he was coming. They had known his route, his timing, his most secret plans. Somewhere there was a traitor, or their spies were even better than he had thought. They had transformed this beautiful, solid bridge into a bomb that waited only to kill him and his entire valuable escort, to destroy the Union military operation that could possibly have turned the war. Without losing even a single second with further considerations or analysis, without wasting time with self-doubt or confusion, he spun lightning fast on his heel and ran back to his men, as fast as his heavy military boots and his American dignity allowed. His voice roared across the entire peaceful riverbank with the urgency and authority of a man who sees death itself running behind him, who knows that seconds decide the lives of more than 40 men. Back. Everyone back. Immediately away from the bridge. The bridge is mined. It's a death trap. For your lives. Second stride. Also, the 43-man escort exploded instantly into wild, panicked activity. Horses jumped in all directions, men screamed warnings and orders in confusion. Everyone galloped as fast as they could away from the bridge, as if the devil himself were pursuing them. Harrison reached Stormwind in a desperate leap, jumped on the first horse he could reach, and drove it with spurs and whip as hard as he could away from the structure he now recognized for what it really was. A carefully constructed, deadly trap. They had just removed themselves about 150 yards from the bridge, their horses foaming and gasping from the sudden, desperate flight, when the entire world around them exploded in chaos of fire, smoke, and destruction. The detonation was deafening, a thundering, earth-shaking crash that startled all birds within a radius of several miles and shattered windows in the town of Franklin. The famous Franklin Bridge literally disappeared in an inferno of wood splinters, metal pieces, stone fragments, and splashing, steaming water. Flames shot 30 yards into the air. A column of orange-red fire that illuminated the gray sky. The shock of the tremendous explosion threw several men from their horses and made the earth tremble as if an earthquake had shaken the land. Debris rained from the sky, large and small pieces of what had once been a proud engineering achievement. As the thick, black smoke slowly cleared and the debris stopped falling from the sky, absolutely nothing remained of the magnificent Franklin Bridge except burning pieces of wood floating like toy boats on the churned, muddy river water, and 2 destroyed, shattered stone pillars that jutted from the river like the broken teeth of a giant. Brigadier General James Harrison sat on the strange horse, his heart beating so loudly and violently he was sure his men could hear it over the crackling and sputtering of burning wood. His hands trembled uncontrollably as the full and terrible significance of what had just happened washed over him like a second explosion. "My almighty God," whispered Colonel Samuel Brown with a voice barely audible from shock and awe, his normally firm voice reduced to a frightened whisper. "If we had crossed the bridge, if we had been in the middle when, we would all be dead." Harrison completed the terrible thought with a toneless voice, his normally commanding features gray with shock. "Every single one of us. No survivors. Completely annihilated." He slowly looked over at Stormwind, who still stood where they had left him when they fled in panic from the bridge. The horse was now completely calm, his ears attentively pointed forward, as if he were patiently waiting for his master's return. There was no trace of the extreme panic and agitation he had shown earlier. No signs of the desperate fear that had prevented him from entering the bridge. He stood there, proud and calm and dignified, as if absolutely nothing unusual or dramatic had happened, as if he were simply waiting for his master's next command. "The horse knew," said one of the younger soldiers. A farm boy from Ohio. His youthful voice full of awe and a kind of religious veneration. "Somehow, in a way we can't understand. Stormwind knew the bridge was a deadly trap. He saved us all. But how is that possible?" asked another man, a veteran from New York, his voice confused and searching. "How can an animal, a horse, know such a thing? How can it sense danger that we humans couldn't see?" Harrison had no answer to these questions. No rational explanation for the inexplicable. He rode slowly and thoughtfully back to Stormwind, dismounted carefully, and approached the stallion with a new kind of respect, almost with reverence. Stormwind gently lowered his head and rubbed his velvet face tenderly against Harrison's chest. A gesture of affection and familiarity that the general had never before received in this intensity from the normally reserved and distant animal. "You saved my life, old friend," murmured Harrison with a voice thick with emotion and gratitude, while he lovingly stroked Stormwind's strong, muscular neck. "You saved all our lives. Not just mine. But every man here. You are more than a horse. You're a miracle." In the following hours, as news of what had happened at the destroyed Franklin Bridge spread like wildfire through the entire Western theater, from camp to camp, from regiment to regiment, a legend developed that went far beyond military facts. American newspapers, insofar as they were able to report on military events without violating censorship, reported only of a prevented Confederate attack on a Union convoy. But the true story, the story of Stormwind, spread in other ways. The soldiers at the front, those men who daily looked death in the eye and daily needed miracles to maintain their morale, told a different story. They told of the black stallion who had possessed supernatural knowledge, the mystically impossible ability to recognize the perfectly camouflaged death trap that the Confederates had prepared with scientific precision. This story, this legend, grew and changed with each retelling, with each transmission from one tired, traumatized soldier to another. With each retelling, Stormwind became less an ordinary animal and more a mythological entity, a manifestation of the American spirit itself, concrete proof that higher forces, whether the God of the Union or simply cosmic justice, stood on the side of freedom. Union soldiers in the trenches of Tennessee and Virginia began to carve and wear small amulets, simple wooden or metal figurines with Stormwind's silhouette engraved, primitive but powerful talismans meant to bring them protection and luck. Union military marches and soldier songs began to contain new verses, improvised stanzas about the mysterious black stallion who had saved General Harrison from certain death. The men who rode and fought under Harrison's command felt renewed confidence, a deep and strong certainty that they were protected by something that lay beyond Confederate rifle bullets, beyond tactical movements on the battlefield, beyond the normal cruelties and accidents of war. The deepest and most bitter irony of the whole affair, perceived at that time by very few, was that the Confederates, the planners and executors of this sophisticated trap, would never learn that their weeks-long prepared, scientifically planned death trap had ultimately failed because of a horse's instinctive behavior. Their spies and informants would only report to them in the following days that Harrison's regiment had never crossed the mined bridge for unknown reasons, that the Union general had avoided the bridge for some mysterious reason and taken another route. The Confederate generals in their comfortable headquarters must have automatically assumed that Harrison had discovered the trap through human intelligence, that some spy or deserter within the Confederate camp had betrayed the carefully guarded plan. They probably imagined endless investigations and purges, searching for the non-existent traitor in their own ranks. They would never, ever guess or even in their wildest dreams imagine that the real reason why one of their most important military plans had failed, why General Harrison continued to live and fight, why Union resistance in the hearts of Western theater soldiers continued to burn like an inextinguishable fire, was simply that a black stallion named Stormwind had categorically refused to cross a certain Tennessee bridge. 32 previous battles. 32 documented occasions when Stormwind's supernatural instincts had saved his master's life, and then a 33rd and possibly most important occasion of salvation. Stormwind would continue to ride and fight under General Harrison until the bitter end of the Civil War, through the terrible final years of 1863 and 1865, through Sherman's march to the sea, the collapse of Confederate lines, the fall of Richmond, and the surrender at Appomattox. When the Confederacy finally surrendered and the once proud Confederate Army was disbanded, when slavery was abolished and a new, uncertain peace was declared, Stormwind was the only silent witness to Harrison's final, bitter exhaustion. Some veterans tell that after the end of the war, the stallion never carried another rider, that he refused to be ridden by anyone else, that he spent his last years on a small farm near Boston in Massachusetts, far from the battlefields and the stench of death, his deep, dark eyes always reflecting an old and unspeakable sadness, the melancholy of one who had seen too much, who had known the future and could not completely prevent the tragedy, but only delay its arrival by a few years. But that is another story, part of another, darker legend that lurks in the shadows of the coming years. What counts from this particular story, what lives on in the memory of soldiers and in the collective soul of America and continues to be told, is that an animal, a seemingly simple horse, demonstrated wisdom and intuition that completely transcended normal human understanding, an enigmatic, inexplicable wisdom that saved a general, that preserved a military cause, that possibly changed the course of history of an entire nation. And all of this, this entire monumental chain of events and consequences, began with the seemingly simple but absolute refusal of a black stallion to cross a Tennessee wooden bridge on a foggy morning in April of the year 1863. This story would take various forms in the coming years and decades. Would be told and retold in taverns and veteran gatherings, in the memoirs of old soldiers and in the dreams of their grandchildren. It would become one of the great American war legends, one of those mythical stories that are larger than truth, more important than facts, more powerful than history itself. In the dark years that would come after the war, during Reconstruction and the Industrial Transformation, in the long, difficult winters of national healing, old veterans in New York and Chicago, in Boston and San Francisco would remember this story as proof that not all was lost, that there was still magic in the world, that the connection between man and animal had something sacred that even the industrial madness of modern war could not destroy. The story of Stormwind would be told in different versions, each with its own details and variations. Some would claim the horse had known where Confederate sharpshooters were hiding, others would swear he could see the future. Some versions would attribute supernatural powers to Stormwind, others would portray him as the reincarnation of ancient American spirits. But the core of the story, the true core, they would always remain the same. An animal had saved human lives through wisdom that lay beyond understanding. Brigadier General James Harrison himself would rarely tell this story. In his later years, after the war, after Reconstruction, after the end of the world he had known and loved, he would become a quiet, thoughtful man. He would live on his small estate in Massachusetts, would write his memoirs, would try to understand the meaning of all those years of bloodshed. But sometimes, on long winter evenings, when the wind whistled through the bare branches of the maples and the fire in the fireplace burned low, he would tell his grandson about Stormwind. He would tell of the black stallion, who was wiser than all generals, who had a soul pure as freshly fallen snow, who could understand the language of angels. You see, he would tell his grandson, his old voice soft and thoughtful, we humans believe we are the masters of creation. We believe our science and our technology and our military art elevate us above all other creatures. But sometimes, just sometimes, nature shows us we are wrong. Sometimes a simple animal shows us that there is wisdom older than our books, instincts more reliable than our calculations. The boy would listen with wide eyes, would try to imagine it all. The war, the horse, the bridge, the explosion. But what would remain most in his memory was not the drama or the danger, but the way his grandfather's eyes lit up when he spoke of Stormwind, the way his voice became soft and reverent. In the years between the wars, the story of Stormwind would become a symbol of something America had lost. The connection to nature, the ability to wonder, the belief in miracles. In a time when everything was being mechanized and industrialized, when cities grew and old ways were forgotten, Stormwind's story reminded people that there were still secrets in the world, that not everything could be explained and cataloged and controlled. Artists would paint pictures of the black stallion. Poets would write verses about his mystical abilities. Composers would compose symphonies that captured the thunder of his hooves and the whinny of his warning. Stormwind would become a figure of American folklore, as real and important as Paul Bunyan or Johnny Appleseed. But perhaps most important of all was that Stormwind's story gave people hope. In a time when America grew from war to war, when millions died for ideals they didn't understand, when the technology of killing seemed to outpace every human advance, Stormwind's story reminded people that life was precious, that intuition could be more powerful than logic, that love was stronger than hate. Confederate archives, opened decades later, would actually confirm the existence of Operation Death Bridge, the deadly Franklin Bridge. The documents would show that Confederate engineers had worked for 3 weeks to construct the perfect trap, that spies had gathered information about Harrison's movements for months, that the entire operation had been one of the most sophisticated and expensive of the war. Confederate records would also show that after the failure of the operation, a massive investigation had been conducted. Dozens of Confederate officers were suspected, interrogated, and some executed because it was believed one of them had warned the Union forces. Confederate leadership simply could not imagine that their perfect trap had been thwarted by a horse's irrational behavior. General Lee himself had personally ordered that every Confederate who had contact with the Union regiment be investigated. The paranoia had become so great that even Tennessee civilians living near the bridge were arrested and interrogated. The Confederates were convinced that a brilliant Union spy had seen through their plans, that a master of espionage had stolen their carefully guarded secrets. Never, in all the years of investigations and speculations, had it occurred to a single Confederate officer that a horse might have discovered their trap. The idea was so absurd, so beyond their rational worldview, that it wasn't even mentioned as a joke. But for those who had been there, for the 43 Union soldiers who had survived, it was not a question of absurdity or rationality. They had experienced it. They had seen how Stormwind refused to enter the bridge, had heard the explosion, had seen the debris fall. For them it was a miracle, as real and tangible as the bread they ate or the water they drank. These men would think differently about animals for the rest of their lives, differently about nature, differently about the limits of human knowledge. They would teach their children to listen to their horses, to respect their dogs, to honor the wisdom of all creatures. They would know, firsthand and without any doubt, that the world was full of secrets greater than human science. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. More important than the military implications or historical consequences. That humility in the face of the unknown is a virtue. That arrogance about nature can be dangerous. That the connection between man and animal is something sacred and powerful that we lose at our own peril. The story ended on that April morning in 1863, but its meaning would live on, would grow and spread like rings on a pond. It would remind people that in a world full of violence and destruction, there was still room for miracles. That the simplest creatures were sometimes the wisest. That love and trust between man and animal could be the most powerful forces in the universe. And so ended the story of Brigadier General James Harrison and his mystical black stallion, Stormwind. Not with death, but with life. Not with destruction, but with salvation. Not with the end of hope, but with its triumph over darkness. Like this story and share it with your friends who love tales of the unexplained and the incredible bond between humans and animals. If you want to hear more amazing stories of courage, intuition, and the mysterious connections that exist in our world, subscribe to our channel. We have many more extraordinary tales waiting to be told. What do you think? Do animals really possess supernatural intuition, or was this just an incredible coincidence? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.